The views and opinions heard on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
My breathing had stopped for so long that my heart actually ended up stopping.
You saw what I did and said that I was going to die.
And then I remember being gone. I wasn't there anymore.
I sort of lifted up about 6 feet above my body.
A pinprick of light appeared and came rushing toward me faster than the speed of light.
And then this light, all of a sudden it was all completely around me.
He says, I am God. Yes, I am real.
The main message was loving yourself and loving others.
It was clearly shown to me.
It was really hard to put into words. It felt like I had been there before.
It was just this very personal, impersonal, unconditional love.
Welcome everyone to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I am your host, Lamont Gates, bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicality, and spirituality. Today, my guest was able to taste both the darkness and the light and learn the value of hope in the event of struggle. Let's get it started. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. Joining us via Zoom is near-death experiencer Paulo Santos. Paulo, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
How are you, man? Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. No problem to have you here. And I understand your experience is very interesting because you had what's called a hybrid experience, which is a bit hellish and a bit heavenly. Is that correct?
It was a lot hellish, and I got to the heavenly part just near the end of it, but yes.
Okay. All right. Good to know. So, but before we get into that, walk us backwards. Talk to us about how you were introduced with the topic of religion and or spirituality as a child. What was it you believed in or was taught on this particular subject?
Sunday church, Easter, Christmas kind of guy. I did spend some time in youth groups and stuff like that. I'm not sure I would ever say I was a devout Catholic at any point until I was 19 years old. I did about a month of mission work in the Philippines, helping the poor under the guidance of the church. And that helped me kind of open my eyes here and there. And then I grew up a little bit and it became harder and harder to be religious in that way. But yeah, I guess I've always found myself to be religious. My parents were always supportive of it. But understanding, the differences of what religion is and what would happen to me later, something that I could never have expected.
So in other words, you grew up Catholic and later on after your experience, did you find it hard to reconcile what you experienced with what you learned growing up in a particular religion?
Yes, absolutely.
So let's talk about the experience itself. How old were you when you had your near-death experience?
I was 38 years old, so this was just into April last year.
So how exactly did your near-death experience come about? What caused it?
So I caught COVID early March. Early March in 2020, COVID was kind of a mess. What was going on? Everybody was in frantic mode. I caught it sometime between March 4 and 6. I was traveling to DC. I remember I was March 6. I was on the train about 3 p.m. I was heading back home from DC, and I get a text message from Amtrak, and it literally says, we've shut down all trains from DC to New York. So I was on the last train out. And I remember taking out the Purell out of my pocket. I started rubbing the chairs down, all that kind of stuff. A week later, I came down with a fever. I fought it at home for about 5 or 6 days. And by March 17th, I was in the emergency room. Those next 2 or 3 days, all I know is that I went to one hospital. I I stopped breathing at that hospital. Later put into an induced coma, and I woke up a few weeks later in another hospital.
So, yeah, this is very. This would have happened, I want to say, at the height of the experience. You're saying last March, and it makes sense why you probably would have woke up in a different hospital. Was that because they were treating COVID patients at that hospital and trying to separate them from the other one?
No, actually, I went to a smaller hospital. They didn't have all the treatments there that the bigger hospital about 15, 20 miles away had. And remdesivir, which became, a big time topic last year, at the time, it was not eligible for public use. They were trying to get me the last dose of it. It turned out my wife, who's a nurse, heard about the medication, fought to get it for me. My story hit DC and Congress allowed it to be released. And I got the last dose of remdesivir in New Jersey at the time.
Wow, that's a whole nother topic. So let's go back to when you were in this hospital bed. Talk to us about what it was like when you realized you were not in this earthly realm anymore.
It was extremely calming. So my entire experience side was basically in various forms of a hospital room. When I first arrived, I was just lying in bed, completely incapable of walking, but for some reason it was kind of normal. I wasn't shocked about it at all. And I just looked around. I found a few things odd, but not concerning. And calm. I was just there. Okay. And eventually I just said, oh wow, I'm dying now. Just like that. It was probably about dawn-ish in the hospital setting that I was in. I was the only one in the room. I could see a glass door in front of me, a glass wall in front of me, like with a door to the right side. And I could see the nurses' stations in the front, but there was nobody there. And the lights were dimmed. And I was just calm, very, very calm. And that's when I realized I was at the moment of dying. And, the more I look back at it, that moment could have been a second. And it was a moment that I was allowed to, I'm going to say, enjoy. Because in a world of worry, it was my existence that had no worry at all. And then the other story started.
So take us into what happened next after this peaceful bliss of dying, so to speak. What did you experience after this?
So I remember being in the bed. I would close my eyes, and I kind of had. You ever watch the old Lion King movies where suddenly a new vision appears? The first thing that appeared was my body in the hospital room. The doctors all around it, trying to keep me alive. In the back corner, wearing a pair of red scrubs and a white sweater, mid-40s, brunette, was crying and praying for me. And she was like screaming, crying, praying. And the only thing I could hear was actually her praying the entire time. And it kept me alive. And I'm watching my body, get worked on while this nurse is praying and screaming in the background. And I'm not there. The lack of emotion is still there. I'm just kind of, okay, like this is calming. But then I start gasping for it. I could feel trying to catch, I don't know if it was a sound or a rhythm, but I felt like if I can just catch this or this noise, I'd be able to come back to life. So I remember starting to make this pa 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 sound that was happening in the background. And sometimes I'd catch it and then fall back down. Sometimes I'd just miss it, and then I'd wake back up in the empty hospital room again. But as it started progressing, I would close my eyes, and suddenly I would keep the prayers would still be heard in the background, but then the sand would shift again, and the scenes would change. And it kept on doing that, except now every time the scenes changed, I watched different of my life happen. I watched as the doctors told my wife and kids that I was dead in different ways. My daughter, who was 8 at the time, got proposed to. I walked down the aisle. I watched as she gave birth. And my son, I watched him get married. I watched my grandkids, watch them die. And all this kept happening like that. And it was almost as if I lived a whole lifetime in a split second. And I guess a lot of stories tell you where they flash back and their whole life flashed before their eyes. Mine wasn't a flash backward. I look at that moment as this amazing gift where God told me, listen, if you need, I'm going to let you see this. And to me, that's what I needed to see. I needed to make sure my family was taken care of, that they were okay and all that. It was very relaxing. It was very, very comforting to know that my family would be okay.
And all throughout this, did you get any communication? A lot of people say communication on that side is usually telepathic. Was there anything being communicated to you?
Loved ones. I guess I was just experiencing the life with them. I was just allowed to watch it happen. Was there anything communicated? I don't know. I could hear people praying. I could feel the prayer. I could feel a physical manifestation of their prayers. But for the most part, I don't remember communications.
So take us into the next scene. What did you see after this?
To the hospital bed, and I'm sitting there, and suddenly I look around, and all the lights are on now. A male nurse, early 30s, young, white, blonde male, comes in. I was like, Paul, I hate to tell you this, but I'm dying now. And I don't know how long I'd been gone at that point. It could have been a couple hundred years, but I just watched my family grow up, and I was just like, okay, what's next? And he started explaining the world to me. He explained to me the process. He says, you're going to go through a phase now. But before I explain all that to you, what do you want to know? And I don't know if I spent a month or a decade with this guy, but he allowed me to ask him every question, and he answered it. He took me through universes and worlds, and he explained to me how the heavens work and how God is in all of this and what the next steps are. The next steps really were, okay, so after all my questioning of him, he explained to me that there were multiple phases of heaven and that his role in all this was to guide people like me. He told me what would happen next was that I would now be sent to this place called the lobby, where he would ask me a single question and determine where I go next. But then he walked out of the room, and I'm looking at it. Remember, this is still a hospital setting I'm in. I'm staring at the wall, and there was this, I remember there being like a metallic plaque on the wall. Basically said, make sure you keep the temperature range in this room between 67 and 73 degrees, right? And that's all the plaque said. I would just stare at it and then look around the room, and I'd look back at the plaque, and then the plaque changed. And the first thing I remember, don't you realize now that all those hours at church was a waste of time? And it kept going. Where's Jesus for you now? Kept going, And it really just mocked me. It was really a mocking thing. And I guess, it was that I transitioned and fell into hell. And I remember being there. This male nurse came in, a big guy, I'll say, 40s-ish. And I remember asking him for help, like help me, what's going on? And he was like, sorry, man. He called in this other nurse to come in, and she was this beautiful 30-something-year-old She was an evil witch woman. She could make things appear and torture me like no other. She would make things appear like my children's, like my baby's pacifier, my daughter's like first blankets. At first, it was physical, right? And basically every day. But then the mental stuff got intense. If I tell you at 3 p.m. every day, you're going to get punched in the face. After a few days, you kind of expect it, and then you move on with the rest of your day, right? But I guess the mental aspect of that was the humility, the shame that it caused that I was okay with it. that I was okay with it happening, that I had given up, that it was just part of my existence now, that it would just happen all the time. So, everybody always asks me what hell was like, right? And I say, if I could sum up hell in one line, hell is a constant reminder of all the wonderful things on earth and all the terrible things happening to your loved ones that you can't do anything about. And it was always brought up, always reminded. I watched my kids get murdered over and over. Who's lost their job, beaten, over and over again. I was supposed to be in only a couple of days. And there's a giant story behind why I got stuck there for so long. But I ended up being in hell for, I will say, for about 40 years. And this was day in, day out, 40 years of this kind of torture. I'm not sure if it was an accident that I got stuck there, but it was wild. And I wish I was a better man, but I'm not. And there was a lot of apologies and things. And it was, stop doing that. And I swear I'll stop. And I'll do whatever you want, kind of thing. You make a lot of bad deals because what else do you have at that point?
A lot of people question, especially on near-death experience group sites, whether hell even exists or not. Some people say it's just a product of your mind. It's a product of your religious teachings. But then you have people who experience it and say it is legitimately a real phenomenon. How would you answer these particular people?
Here's the best way I can explain. By the way, it's crazy that in a near-death experience, we have to abide by any rules, when anybody should acknowledge that any rules that we set here don't exist. There are no rules to how this works. What's some place you'd love to travel to one day? Just
I don't think I can escape my couch. I mean, it's the best place in the world.
All right, so let's say you want to go to Hawaii one day, right?
Gotcha.
What do you do? Why is it so exciting to you? You read books, you want to check out where you want to go, see where the best foods are, all that kind of stuff, right? You do a little research on it. And then you may probably ask, hey man, where's the best place to go? Oh, what restaurant, what did you do while you were there? So to the people who doubt this or any other NDE experience, you could ask anybody about Hawaii and they could tell you all the facts and figures about it, because they could tell you all that without ever having been there, right? I couldn't tell you any details about Hawaii, but I could tell you the best hotel. I could tell you what my experience there is like, and you wouldn't question it. But for some reason, we still question what people say happened to them. But we say, oh yeah, Hawaii is the greatest place because I surfed on a 20-foot wave there. We don't question that. And we have the ability to go there to Hawaii today and experience it for ourselves. The true irony of it all is we can go to Hawaii. We all will die. We all will go through some sort of process at the end of this life. So whether or not you believe what one person experienced or another is pretty irrelevant. It's their experience and they're sold on it, and it can't be taken away from them.
So take us to what happened next after this hellish experience. Where did you find yourself afterwards?
So I found myself one day in another hospital, and the nurse comes in. And she's like, hey, I'm like, whoa, why are you so nice all of a sudden? Everybody gives me an iPad, and I FaceTime my wife, who is 83 years old, dead, in heaven, and it's the first time we've had conversations. And I realized, and I'm basically almost like in a weird in-transit phase to not put my body into shock, into heaven. Heaven just shows up. And when I say shows up, it's, heaven, people could relate it to lights and grass and clouds and sky. If hell is nothing but worry of all the wonderful things you're missing and all the terrible things, and heaven to me was just the complete lack of concern. And it was extremely just wonderful, just in love and no more worry, just pureness, pure purity. It's hard to give words to it, right? I was always trying to pin down what point my heaven situation started, but I think heaven really started when all the worry was gone, and I don't think there was necessarily that I could explain, but it was overwhelming emotion that just took over. It just took over. It was just everywhere and everything. And green grass and blue skies wouldn't exist that it needs. But I guess there's almost no earthly explanation for what it actually felt like. I always tell people, when people try for me to explain what heaven is, it's not your fault. You're not smart enough to. More importantly, I'm not smart enough to explain it, because it's just beyond both of what we're capable of doing. It'll always be a mystery, because neither one of us will ever be able to fully explain it, just because we're not built to do that in this world. Even if you look at all the near-death experiences, one of the common things, the time doesn't exist in that realm. The lack of time, we can't even imagine. I can't even tell this story straight, because there's no progressive timeline necessarily, right? So it's one of those very crazy, I had this wonderful experience, but no words that I ever say will fully be able to explain it to anybody. Because of that, every NDE, I think, would always go with, it was a special experience for them.
Did you receive any messages? I know you saw many images while you were in the hellish experience. Did you receive any messages here that pertain to your life in this heavenly experience?
Yeah, so what was fascinating was, so let me just take a step back into hell. When I was in the deepest parts of my torture down there, it was the first time I heard God calling, and he says, stop struggling and just stop and just keep fighting for it. And then he just didn't stop talking to me. And he kept telling me, come on, just keep going. You could do this. And it was almost as if he didn't want to give up on me. But whatever it was, that it was that message of him giving me hope that got me there. And the underlying message of it all for me, obviously I saw a lot of, crazy future stuff happen. Who knows if and what will come. The underlying message of it, well, honestly, was just a message of hope. It was just always hope. Never stop. He drew out a map for me, so it's pretty wild. There was this map drawn out, and one of the questions I had asked for this: explain to me how God could exist, but we can still do whatever we want. He drew a map. He drew a dot of where I started today. This is you right now. And then he started drawing up and down, from left to right, vertical lines of dots, up and down. And he says, every single one of these dots is a left to right, and by the time you're done, there's a gigantic roadmap with infinite directions of where your life will end up. And God can't tell you where to go and which directions to make, but that can happen on an infinite scale no matter what. For me, that gave me a lot of perspective, right? Everything we do is still our choice at the end of the day.
That's a really good takeaway you come away with, which is hope and to keep fighting, especially with the day-to-day struggles that humans consistently face. Coming back from your near-death experience, did you return with many people say they come back with perhaps a bolt of precognition, sixth sense, heavier empathy, more understanding? Did you come back with any of these so-called gifts?
Yeah. Obviously, there's a lack of fear, which is really interesting. I think most people just fear death, not because of the torture. They fear death because they fear it's an ending. The greater empathy obviously relates to a lot of the people, especially this past year, of everything that has happened. A lot of people want to talk to me just to know that their loved ones are okay and not the end. And I think more than anything else, that's enough for a lot of people. It really is. People who are going through real grief, to know that it's not the end, it's kind of okay. question that everybody always asks me, right? If God and this angel told you so much, tell me, why do good people have to suffer? And it's a question everybody always asks me. The answer became very clear. Lamont, have you ever stubbed your toe before?
Yes.
Is that suffering? Is that what you would consider suffering?
Very temporarily, but no, not in the grand scheme of suffering, no.
Right. Would you consider somebody who's had cancer for 10 years and, right? Would you consider a mom who lost her children suffering? Right? When we look at the perspective of, what we talked about before in time, a stubbed toe is not suffering because it only lasts but a second or a minute. If we really believe that life is eternal, right? And all that, and there's so much more after life and after, even 10, 20 years of suffering and cancer or watching your kids die, that moment, still a stubbed toe in the timeline of your eternity. I wish I thought of it myself, but it's not me. So they did tell me that. And what we deem as suffering here is just a stubbed toe at the grand scheme of our lives.
And, if people understood it that way, if they understood the concept of eternity in general, I think they would understand what you're trying to explain to them. The problem is this human life, I believe they think it's the only life, and not realizing that you're never really born and you never really die. Your soul is eternal. And therefore, as you stated, there is eternity, and that little blip in your past life, doesn't even compare to the eternal length of time that you are in existence.
Yeah. To say that this very short 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years of our lives, whatever it is for people, is all there is. It is a belief that I wish most people can get past. This earthly existence will end for us at some point. We'll have to get to that finish line. What comes next, right, is what we're all in this, what we're talking about right now. And that no matter what comes next, the fact that there is a next is powerful enough.
Absolutely. And as you stated earlier, we will get to that finish line no matter what. So people will come to the knowledge and the truth of that next that you speak of. Well, Paulo, I want to thank you for coming on Real Spiritual Talk Radio and sharing your account with us. It's been very enlightening, and I hope that others listening to your account can also be spiritually enlightened and come to a more secure understanding of your message of hope.
Lamont, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. And yes, please, people like Lamont and the groups like we're in Facebook and these NDE groups, it's just time for us to kind of open our eyes and open our minds a little bit more and just listen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paulo Santos. And I want to thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. Be sure to catch me on my Facebook page, Real Spiritual Talk Radio, and there you will find past shows as well as other relevant near-death experience information. It's always my pleasure to bring these shows to you, and I hope you all have been spiritually enlightened, just the way I have been and always am. And with that said, I am your host, Lamont Gates, and this is Real Spiritual Talk Radio, now signing off.